Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I've just been asked to do a very, very brief introduction to our speaker tonight, Dr. Sean Gabb, well-known writer, author, academic head of the Centre for Ancient Studies, former director of the Libertarian Alliance, author of how many books is it now? 40, something like that. I came across his work a few years ago. I came across a book called Cultural Revolution, Culture Wars, and it really struck me. It had quite an influence on my thinking. And the basic thesis of it I thought was important, which was, given the domination of all our institutions by the postmodern left or cultural Marxists, whatever we want to call them, what are libertarians supposed to do? What should libertarians be trying to do to counter this influence? And then more recently, his latest book is Radical Coup, A Case for Reaction, which extends on that subject. I think the basic idea behind it is that conservatives and libertarians should attempt to forget their differences and work together, because that's the only way that we can even imagine bringing about a situation where liberty may thrive in this country.
Well, thank you. It is very impressive to see so many people come out on a wet Thursday evening, on a night when I am in competition with David Starkey and with something to do with the Conservative Party. Thank you for coming out, and I hope that when I've finished, you think that it was not a waste of your time. Let me think now. When I came out as a libertarian in 1977, which is a very long time ago now, it's 42 years ago, when I came out as a libertarian, I thought that we were the wave of the future. I thought that the 1950s and 60s and most of the 70s had been rather disappointing. Too much inflation, too many taxes, and too much of trade union power. But we were about to get ourselves a real conservative government led by a genuine conservative who had drunk from the well springs of libertarian ideology, and that after 5 years or so of Margaret Thatcher, we would be moving steadily, but rapidly, towards a libertarian utopia. I was at the time 17. Oh, and actually some of you don't look much older than 17, but you're still looking rather pityingly at me. But, well, I was young, and although I knew a fair bit about the history of the past, I knew nothing about the history of the future in those days, and I was wrong. Something went hideously wrong, didn't it? Something went terribly wrong. I was willing to think that we might not get rid of income tax until about 1990. I never imagined that we would become some kind of... I remember in the 1980s, when I'd given up on optimism, I would sit around with various friends discussing, what will the future be like? Will it be like Brave New World, or will it be like 1984? And our usual conclusion was that the future of this country would be very like Terry Gilliam's film Brazil. Has anyone seen it? Yes. Yes. For a film made in the early 1980s, it was remarkably, it showed remarkable foresight. And so I come here tonight after a lifetime of systematic, though often rather enjoyable, failure as a political activist. It is quite obvious that I was not able, after 1977, to bring about any of the changes that I believed were just around the corner, and which I needed to do nothing more to bring on than to sit back and wait. So let me turn to the book that Lawrence praised, Cultural Revolution, Culture War. It's an ingenious book. I published it first in 2007, and it had a great deal of influence. It had a great deal of almost immediate influence on the language and analysis of our present state of things used by UKIP and many other persons and organisations that you could put broadly on the right. I think I did more or less get it right. There are a number of faults of analysis which I try to clean up in the next edition, which was published last year. The broad thesis of the book is that we do have a new kind of ruling class in this country which uses what you might call cultural leftism as its legitimizing ideology, and that it is trying to hammer us into a new people. It follows from that since we face a very similar enemy, an enemy of both liberty and tradition, that libertarians and conservatives should join forces. We should sink our various differences for the purpose of seizing control of the state apparatus and then using it to bring about a revolution or a counter-revolution of our own. I won't say anything more about the book. If you want a copy, do email me and I'll send you a complimentary PDF. What I'd like to talk about is why all of these books by me and other people like me are just fantasies, just pipe dreams. Structures built on, castles built on sand, there you are, or castles in the air, you might even call them. There is something wrong with our entire way of going about politics. Let me say this. If you go to the J.B. Morrell Library in York University, which has a very large section on classical liberalism, or if you go to the library in the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, it has a very good library, or it did the last time I was allowed inside the building. You will find hundreds, you'll find thousands, and if you go to the right places, you'll find tens of thousands of books published during the past 150 years by classical liberals, by conservatives, and by outright libertarians, which address every single issue of our various ideologies and which demolish every jot and tittle of the opposing ideologies of statism. Everything, I do assure you, is completely covered. Nothing is unsaid. There may be some new and killer points to be made by libertarians or classical liberals or conservatives, but I honestly doubt that there is. And if anybody comes up with something that seems radical and new, I suspect very strongly that it is simply a rediscovery or a reiteration of something that was said a very long time ago. And yet, this vast and intellectually distinguished and indeed unanswerable literature of classical liberalism, of conservatism and of libertarianism has had absolutely zero effect on the world. I remember back in I did some work many years ago on the history of education in this country. And one of the most important, one of the most illuminating books on the history of state education in this country is by E.G. West, Education and the State, Institute of Economic Affairs, I believe 1968. Has anybody heard of it? No. perhaps you're not studying the history of education in this country, or perhaps you are, in which case I'm still not surprised you've never heard of it. It is a most remarkable book. What it does is to take the facts of the early and middle 19th century and to subject them to a close examination. For example, the historical accounts of state education in 19th century England are that a fundamentally illiterate and uneducated people were taken in hand by the benevolent state starting in 1847, and gradually the light of education was extended from the middle classes to the upper reaches of the working class, until eventually, after the 1870 Education Act and the 1893 and 1905 Education Acts, we could finally talk of ourselves as a civilized and educated country, and that at all times this progress was a result of state action. E.G. West looks at these claims and demolishes them one at a time. It seems that we were already, by the 1830s, a very educated and a highly literate society, indeed we had been for several hundred years, and that the fastest growth of literacy took place before 1870, and that all of the statistics adduced by the advocates of state education in the 1850s and 60s were effectively made up. What West demonstrates is that there was no need for any state intervention whatever in the education of the people in this country. It was something which was already being sorted. A most remarkable and a most convincing thesis. Do you find it cited in the bibliographies of any mainstream history of education? No. Has anyone teaching the history of education in this country ever heard of the book? No. Does anybody read the book? No. I suppose if you're one of the people who is allowed inside the Institute of Economic Affairs building in London, you might come across it, but it is effectively a dead book. It disappeared into the memory hole 50 years ago. It is a non-book, but it is of enormous interest, and it is entirely convincing. And there are other books of this kind. 35 years ago, I was involved with the launch by the Social Affairs Unit of a book called A Diet of Reason, a book of essays which took issue with the emerging consensus on diet and health. The book was published with a great fanfare because Digby Anderson, who ran the social affairs in those days, was quite good at making friends who had plenty of cash. And the book was on television, the book was on the radio. Indeed, at one point, we commissioned an audio cassette and had hundreds and hundreds of copies made for distribution to radio stations in this country and in the United States. That was how you got things on the radio in those days. The book made quite a splash. It was discussed in the Daily and Sunday Telegraph. The enemy, the food controllers, the people who now run our lives, they were back-footed for a few weeks, or as often as the book was discussed and the various writers were allowed onto the media. But they didn't go away, they didn't lose, they just carried on rolling forward. I could go through a whole library of books which are most remarkable in the intellectual sense, but in the sense of actually changing the world amount to non-books. And most of our books are in that category. Most of our books are non-books. We are right, and nobody pays any notice of us. We are the Cassandras of politics. And so what I could do is to talk to you about how we will seize power in some kind of revolutionary coup, and we will do X, Y, and Z in the first 6 weeks of our administration, and after 18 months we shall have reached these targets. But I do feel that to do that might inspire you, might give you a good laugh, but it would not be addressing any of the real problems that we face. There is no point in being right. Before we can explain to the world that we are right, we need to find some way of making the world pay attention to us. And what can we do about that? How do we get our message across? I have friends who spent much of their lives trying to find some rich sugar daddy. Someone with lots and lots of money who will allow us to set up radio stations, internet television companies, an online university, someone who will bankroll us as we run campaign after campaign after campaign. My view is that that again is also building castles in the air. Back in the 80s, there was a lot of money floating around for our sort of ideas, and a lot of this was caught by the Social Affairs Unit, and it was used quite often for fairly good purposes. But problems. The first is that rich men rather fancy themselves as the next Lorenzo de Medici. That because they are paying the piper, they expect, not unreasonably, to call the tune. And so they state the tune that we shall sing, they state the tune to which we shall dance. And so far as it may not be a very catchy tune, it will have no particular effect. Another problem is that our movement, in the broadest sense, our movement is filled with scam artists. There is something called the 80-20 rule of funding, which is that if some rich sugar daddy comes forward and gives you £10,000, you'll spend £1,000 or £2,000 of that on employing somebody else who'll do the work that you are supposed to do. You'll spend the other £8,000 or £9,000 on cocaine and whores. And I've seen this again and again and again. And yet I've seen it so often that the rich sugar daddies have quietly departed. They've had their fingers burned too often. When Paul Sykes, anyone remember Paul Sykes? The supermarket man from the north of England. He turned up in politics in this country about 20 years ago, announcing that he had £20 million that he would put into campaigns to leave the European Union. Most worthy. It's just that he found that he was getting 20 sacks of post every week, all of it begging letters from people who were often mad, but more often, as I said, scam artists looking for the next money fix. The rich men have been frightened away by this. I could, if the cameras weren't rolling, give you the names of some of the people who've helped to frighten the rich sugar daddies away. But even if they hadn't been frightened away, they have their own agenda, and it is not an agenda conducive to building a successful political movement. And so what can we do? What should we do? Let me put this to you. A couple of years ago, many years ago now, I was having lunch with a Jewish friend, And at one point, his daughter came in and said, "Oh, Daddy, there's a window cleaner at the door. He's asking, you know, do we have any business for him?" And my friend rolled his eyes in a rather Fagin-esque manner and rubbed his hands together and said, and I still don't know if this was for my benefit or if it was an entirely genuine outburst, his question was, "Is he a Jewish window cleaner?" Now, there is an entire movement, of course, of which we're not members, which would turn that story into a sinister example of ethnic nepotism. I prefer to see it as an interesting example of how a movement is created and sustained, not in intellectual terms, but at its lowest common denominator. One of the reasons why Jews are successful is that they're rather clever, but there are many clever groups which never get anywhere. I think the main reason why Jews are successful wherever they go, wherever they're allowed to settle, is because part of their culture includes a settled preference for dealing with their own. And it's not only Jews who do this, it's Muslims, it's Seventh-day Adventists, it's Quakers, it is Freemasons. You can go through any number of groups of broadly successful people, the foundations of whose success lie in this fact that they have a settled preference for dealing with their own. Let me tell you another story that doesn't involve Jews. About 10 years ago, a Muslim was, he stopped outside a mosque to say his prayers, and when he came out, he found he'd been clamped. His car had been clamped. And so, and the clamping people were saying, "Come, we want £90 to unclamp this vehicle, otherwise we'll tow it away." Well, this young man who'd come out of the mosque to find his car clamped knew a thing or two about the law, and something he knew was that you cannot tow away a clamped car if there's somebody sitting in it. And so he got into his car and sat there. And there was a standoff between him and the clamping company. They knew he couldn't stay there forever. He'd have to come out sooner or later. What they didn't know was that there had been more than one person in that mosque. And they all came out with cups of tea, with little meals for him, and perhaps they came out with potties for him. Whatever the case, they stood around the car in a peaceful, rather civilized way, making it clear that they were not impressed by the actions of these clamping operators. And there was a standoff between a large and growing Islamic community and a couple of hapless clamping operators. This went on for about 10 hours, until eventually, after much furious telephoning of the head office, the young Muslim man was able to give them £50 to get rid of them, even though they had tried to double the fine every 2 hours according to their schedule of rules. We're all libertarians, aren't we? If that happened to you, how many friends could you call on to come and stand around the car looking strong in a non-aggressive way? No, not many, could you? No. Another thing, you must have heard these stories of how members of UKIP are sometimes not allowed to foster children because the local authority says, "Oh no, political extremism, safeguarding matter." And then you must have heard about these political activists whose children get taken into care or who find themselves in various other kinds of trouble. How many Muslim children are taken by the social workers into care? The answer is not very many. And it's not necessarily because the social workers would have their throats cut if they tried to break into these houses and take the children away, though in some cases they might. It is because, again, if they go into an Islamic household and start interfering with the upbringing of the children there, a large and well-connected crowd will form in the street, and these social workers will feel intimidated. That's something which we as a movement, libertarians, classical liberals, conservatives, indeed just English people in general, it is something that we lack. We have no community leaders. We have no custom of standing up for each other. How many times have you seen people done over by the authorities and other people have just shuffled by on the other side looking in the other direction because they don't want to get involved? That's something where, that's one of the reasons why we as a movement have been such failures. Let me give you another illustration of how we're falling down. If you go back to about 1980, there were conservatives, classical liberals, and libertarians all over the place. There were newspaper editors, there were television producers, there were theatrical directors, there were civil servants, there were professors and senior lecturers, there were sympathetic people in the city and in large companies. There really were our people all over the place. These people are getting rather elderly and coming up for retirement or just dying. Do they hand over to the next generation of conservatives, classical liberals, and libertarians? No, they don't. What they do is they relinquish their positions and allow them to be captured by the adherents of other ideologies, because partly they have no concept that they are trustees for a movement or for a particular people of the positions they occupy, and also because there has been no reproduction process over the years so that their trained replacements are there and ready at hand. That's another reason why we have not simply failed to go forward during the past 40-odd years, but we have gone rapidly backwards. And so, let me come back to this. Let me come back to my Jewish friend with his window cleaner. Have you ever thought about only doing business, or rather having a settled preference for doing business with people who share your political ideals? Have you ever thought about not just seeking out the cheapest accountant or lawyer or the nearest dentist or whatever GP comes first in the alphabet in the telephone directory or on the website? Have you ever thought about making quiet inquiries among your friends to find out which of these kinds of people share your particular ideals? If you're old enough to employ plasterers and bricklayers and painters and decorators and roofers and electricians and plumbers, have you ever thought of having a look round to see which of those people share your ideals? Is this something which has never crossed your mind, or is it something that has crossed your mind and not been done, or is it perhaps something that you already do? And if you are someone who does it, you are in an insignificant minority within our movement. Have you ever thought about regarding your ideological network as the beginnings of an economic and financial network, because that is how a successful movement is formed. A successful movement is also a successful community, and a successful community functions because its various members have, what I will say for the third time, is a settled preference for their own. Go back to look at the Jews or the Armenians or any other small ethnic group which for most of its history has had no independent homeland. How are they successful? They are successful because they recognize each other, they promote each other, they do business with each other. It does not necessarily mean that they have done so to our detriment, but they have certainly done so to their advantage. And rather than certain other organizations which denounce this kind of networking as somehow sinister, we should perhaps learn from it. I have done this myself for many years. I can't say that I have set the world on fire. I cannot say that I have built a large and thriving libertarian conservative network in the eastern part of Kent. But I do assure you that if it is a question of getting somebody in to fix the roof or to repaint the front of the house, I do not simply go for the cheapest or the first person or the first person I come to. I do make some inquiry as to what these people believe. Now let's have a look at further benefits of this. Anjem Choudhury, heard of him? A most wicked man, isn't he? A troublemaker. Mind you, I wouldn't have sent him to prison just for speaking his mind about the duty of British Muslims to go out to Syria and fight in the civil war. I would regard that as fair comment. I may not agree with it, but it's certainly fair comment by my view. But the important point is that he was sent to prison. He's a jailbird, is Anjem Choudhury. If that happened to any one of us, we'd be finished. Let's imagine that you sound off on Twitter or Facebook. You say something that seemed rather witty at the time, but the transsexual activists or the feminists or the homosexuals or some ethnic pressure group, they decide that they are deeply offended by what you've said and they lean on the police and the police arrest you and something goes a bit wrong and you find yourself with a criminal record. You're dead. For all purposes that matter, except that you carry on breathing oxygen, you're dead, you're finished, you'll never work again. That's it. You've got a criminal record. You're done. Most of your friends will be rather embarrassed to be around you because they have ambitions, and hanging around with somebody who has a criminal record does not promote those ambitions. Well, let's look at Anjem Choudhury again. Came out of prison. He'll never have trouble paying gas bills. Once all the dust has settled, at the moment he's being kept at the taxpayer's expense, as soon as the dust has settled, he'll get himself some nice, gentle, well-paid job within the Islamic community, because there is an Islamic community. And although most Islamic individuals are not enormously rich themselves, because there are so many of them, the Islamic community is able to dispose of very large sums of money, some of which can be spent on giving soft jobs to people like Anjem Choudhury. And so because he and his sort know that they will never, whatever they say, however long they go to prison for, they'll never have trouble feeding their wives and children. Wives, yes. And they'll never have trouble paying gas bills. They will be more inclined to tell the British state, get stuffed, I'll say whatever I like. You can put me in prison for a few months at a time, but I'll be out and I'll carry on saying it. You can't say that, I can't say that, because we know perfectly well that if any one of us as an individual comes to the malign attention of the authorities, we are finished. And the reason for that is that we do not live as members of a networked community, a deeply networked community. And because we are not members of a deeply networked community, we are not able to tell rich funders, we're not able to tell sugar daddies when they come our way, well, this is the deal, you can help to fund this or you can sod off. You see, if you're a rich Muslim and you want to get involved in funding some aspect of Islamic outreach in this country, you can't march around like you can't march around like the Lord's anointed and all these imams and people hang on your every word. Oh yes, yes, Mr. Khan, yes, we entirely agree with you. Oh, what a funny joke you've just given. No, of course I don't do that. They'll treat you like someone who has money, which it is your duty to hand over. They won't treat you like dirt, but they won't treat you like a king either, because they know that you are simply funding. You are buying the privilege of being able to say that you assist with a project which is not of your making, because you are confronted, no, not confronted, you are presented with an existing network, an existing community. Whereas, as I said, with our rich sugar daddies, we present ourselves as individuals and he calls the tune to which we dance. Now, what we could do is we could sit around saying, yes, we've got to leave the European Union on the 29th of March, and we've got to have a general election at some point this year, and we've got to elect the right people to Parliament, and then we can do all of these wonderful things that are on our various agendas. And my response is that you are wasting your time in talking about these matters, so long as you and we are not members of a tightly and deeply networked community. A community which will outlive us, a community which we support and which supports us, and a community which is able to reach out beyond itself and insist on and sometimes obtain advantageous changes. And so rather than sit around thinking about how we should fight some repeat referendum on the European Union, which may or may not be thrown at us, I don't know, rather than talking about the politics, and certainly rather than trying to set up a top-down campaigning institution which requires large contributions from the usual suspects, we really should be looking to see how we as individuals can help to create and can help to strengthen a community of communities of like-minded people, the kind of people to whom we can give jobs, the kind of people who will give us jobs, the kind of people who will stand by us in adversity, and the kind of people whom we shall feel no shame and no sense of danger in standing beside in their moments of adversity. Only when we can say, without drawing a belly laugh from anybody else, I am a member of the libertarian community, only then, or let's say the conservative or classical liberal community, only when we can stand up and say without attracting derision, I am a member of a community and we will not stand for this, only then are you and we as a whole in any chance of making progress. So I've spoken for about 40 minutes, I think. I think I've said everything I ought to. So thank you for having listened.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gabb. That was a very fascinating talk. I'm going to ask a couple of questions before opening to the floor, if that's okay. So, first of all, you talked about libertarian, classical liberal, and conservative as almost being synonymous. Why do you think that conservatives share like a very similar goal to us in this kind of time?
There's a number of answers to that question. The first is that in England, it is very difficult to be a conservative without also being some kind of libertarian, because the English tradition is not entirely, but very largely about liberty. Things like freedom of the press, trial by jury, representative government, accountable government, and so on. And so it is difficult to call yourself a conservative in this country unless you're also a bit of a libertarian. There are other countries, Russia, for example, would be a good example. Russia would be a very good example in which it is possible to be either a libertarian or a traditionalist Russian conservative. Oh, I'm not saying that traditionalist Russian conservatism is entirely totalitarian, but it probably doesn't contain many libertarian elements. So that is one answer to your question. The other answer to your question is that although we have different objectives, we are, for the moment, stuck in the same lunatic asylum. Yes, that's it. We're trapped inside a lunatic asylum run by the usual suspects. As soon as, if we can break out of this asylum, we shall go and catch buses going in different directions. But until then, we are trapped in this asylum, and so if we want to break out, we should perhaps smile at each other and not dwell on the many differences that that separate us. Those are two possible answers to your question. Do they satisfy?
Sure. I think there's quite a divergence within the British Libertarian Movement, whereas you have groups such as the Institute of Economic Affairs and people like the Adam Smith Institute, who are possibly more hinging on the economic and socially liberal part, whereas there are people who are more kind of socially conservative. So yeah, it's hard to build this kind of group identity when you have such like differences within the libertarian movement.
Oh, but you don't need to wait for any substantial agreement within the British libertarian movement as a whole. You can carry on despising Madsen Pirie and laughing at him, and having known Madsen reasonably well for nearly 40 years, I can tell you that there is much to laugh at about Madsen Pirie, and perhaps a little to despise as well. And I might say the same about the Institute of Economic Affairs. We don't need we don't need a monolithic organization. What I'm talking about is that we find people who share our general outlook and form a community with them. When you're making scrambled egg, oh, there's an example. When you're making scrambled egg, you break the eggs into a saucepan and you pour in the milk and you stir it. And for a long time, it's just a runny liquid, isn't it? So it's just a rather sticky liquid. And then little blobs appear here and there. And you keep on stirring it until eventually it turns into a solid. And that is how I see the ideal progress of our movement over the next 50, 60, maybe 100 years. We start off as individuals. We then form ourselves into small clusters of individuals until eventually we become a great network of communities. The history of the Christian church, the origins of the Christian church, is a very good example of this. A despised and an occasionally persecuted minority. Among the lower classes, renegade Jews, slaves, a few women in the higher classes, meeting together. No substantial agreement on theology at the time, but these people had one principle of success which the pagans quite often didn't have. That is absolute loyalty to each other. Without going through all the reasons contributing to the success of the Christian churches in the early days, one of them is that if the barbarians turn up and storm the city walls and lead the inhabitants off into slavery, hats will pass round all over the empire, and various Christian ministers will be off to deal with the barbarians, to ransom the Christians out of captivity. Or if they're sold back into the empire as slaves, to identify and liberate them. One of the reasons why Christianity became hegemonic within the Mediterranean world after about 300 was because becoming a Christian was not simply a matter of being able to say, I've had the sprinkling of water, I'm going to heaven, I shall spend forever on the right-hand side of Jesus Christ singing hallelujahs. It wasn't just that, there were substantial benefits in this life to being a member of the Christian church. And so we should try to reproduce those benefits among ourselves.
So you're advocating for a kind of strong group identity, but I could argue that, like, historically this kind of group tends to promote corruption and authoritarianism, and I think one of the reasons that England became England had a lot of human progress and advancements before many other countries is because of the lack of group identity, which promoted the kind of individual rationalism. What do you think of this?
I'm not suggesting that we should. I'm not suggesting that we should all join something like a religious cult, where we subsume our individuality in loyalty to some messianic leader. No, I'm just suggesting that we should regard ourselves as members of a group or of groups, and that we should act as such. I'm not saying that we should stop behaving as individuals, but we should perhaps stop behaving as atomized individuals. That's it. There's the difference. There's a big difference between being an individual and being an atomized individual. And where we suffer is because we are atomized. There is no overriding community.
I'm sorry I missed the beginning of this meeting. So I missed the definition of libertarianism. I'm not completely sure. Someone flippantly said libertarianism was basically trying to be a conservative, small and large C, but wanting to smoke ganja at the same time. I don't know if that's necessarily a very accurate description. I came in when you were discussing what sounded like tribalism, and I do believe that we are all tribal. And there's never been more tribes than in this day and age, when communication is so easy via social media and can so easily be shut down, as Mr. Robinson is finding. But one of the things that has to be said is that today people are atomized. We are living in this country in ever smaller housing units. Not all of us are living with anyone else. Many of us live alone. And the easiest way to pull people together is via the internet. And it's a huge tool for any movement. So I wonder whether a kind of new Freemasonry, which is what you seemed at one point, without necessarily a God, or respecting God, but not necessarily sort of submitting to, theocracy, is the solution, or whether in fact social media. And the other thing is we all belong to several communities. I belong to various communities myself. And I don't like the word community. I think we are all in a community. It's up to us to reach out to the people around us. And finally, 40%, I gather, of the male population has a criminal record, 30% of the female. So I don't think it's that fatal unless you've got a very long stint, necessarily, unless you're looking for jobs in the public sector, which are controlled by communists.
Yeah, thank you. I would just like to say that 2 months ago, a gentleman called Steve Bannon came to Oxford, and 1,000 of Oxford students brought this city to a standstill, shouting all sorts of abuse against him. I had the opportunity of going to interview the young lady who organised that very successful protest. And I asked her 3 questions. First being, why are you protesting? He's a fascist, she said to me. Have you listened to his speech? No, she said to me. Well, how do you know he's a fascist? Well, and then she got upset with me, and I said to her, though, well, if you're complaining against Mr. Steve Bannon, you haven't heard him, what does that make you? At which point she walked away in disgust at my point of view. Now, this happened, this 2 months ago when I interviewed her. I would say to you, sir, that we have lost anyone under 25. If you speak to any of the privileged students of Oxford, you'll be shocked at how anti-free speech they are. For them, free speech simply means this: saying things that they agree with. And anyone who says anything that they don't agree with, they are awfully quick to no-platform them. I'd also say to you, sir, that we have lost the real sad thing about this country is that we have lost tomorrow's generation. Mm-hmm. We've completely lost them. I don't know what's happened to the voice of the English man and English woman, but I do know that just saying the word English and supporting English, and you're likely to be called a racist. Yeah. And until all of us reclaim England with all that it stands for, with Magna Carta, with freedom of speech, we're in great trouble.
We are indeed in great trouble. I will say nothing. I could say things, but many other people want to speak, and I've probably said enough.
You don't want to answer the questions now?
I'll come back to it.
Sure.
This vetting process, as you could call it, how would you begin? Because it seems a little rude just to ask somebody, excuse me, mate, I won't employ you, but I've built off, unless I know you're a libertarian or a conservative like me.
Well, you have to start somewhere, don't you? Let me not answer the question of how you start it, but once you have started it, you can ask round discreetly, can you find me a plasterer? I want someone who shares our opinions on these matters. But in the first instance, you might have to go to a pub and say, anyone here a screaming high Tory who fancies doing a bit of plastering? You have to start somewhere.
I was just wondering if you would answer the question that was raised about, how would you define libertarianism? What does it mean to you?
Oh, okay. A libertarian is somebody who wants to be left alone, who wants to leave other people alone, and who wants other people to leave other people alone. Everything else is a matter of details. A libertarian is someone who wants to live as an atomized individual, but it's certainly someone who is at least rather skeptical about the benefits of coercion?
First of all, thank you for your talk. And I think building a community based on moral values is why either faith-based or ideology-based, like communism or fascism, are so successful, because people seeing it higher aim. So then shall liberty-oriented people make moral case as a main, which would follow then material part of it, in your view?
Yes. Let me come back to the gentleman over there who made a very good point about the power of the left. Obviously I don't like the left, but we need to try to understand the basis of the great power that they currently have. They don't like freedom, fair enough. But what gives them the power to silence dissent is the fact that they operate as members of communities. They know that they should stand together. The reason they're more successful than we are is not because they are right and we are wrong, in that it's the opposite, and I don't need to argue that. The reason they are successful and we are not is because they understand that they must operate as members of a community of communities. And that's why they do it. They promote each other. They employ each other. They give degrees to each other. They review each other's books. They invite each other onto television chat shows. There's an entire, they are a movement of movements, doing favours for each other. And what are we? We are not that. And that is one reason, perhaps the main reason, why we are not successful.
Hi, Sean. So what's the catalyst? You know, the historical literature, Proudhon talks about circles of association rather than communities, his different circles of association. The mutualists in early 20th century San Francisco praised the cooperative movement itself, British, you know, self-help movement. Anthony Fisher wrote, when they decided to jump in bed with the Labour Party, that they would have been better going into bed with the Liberals because they were all about voluntary association and so on. J. Neil Schulman writes about it, you know, in A Long Side Night. I always think of the sort of the sense of wonder when he goes down into the Agora for the first time and sees this huge trading network of like-minded people who have already set this up. Even Cameron talked about the big society, for example, and that was a similar network of networks. But on the other side, there's, you know, people like Spencer and Knock who would say, well, actually, we've got to ride this out. It's got to get as bad as it can. It's got the state has got to get to the point where it consumes everything, and then there'll suddenly be a waking up that, you know, that because we'll be in dire straits and we will need to fend for ourselves and find a way of doing it ourselves. So is it a catastrophe that's the catalyst, or is there a new co-op movement, for example?
I don't know. You're asking all sorts of hard questions, Jock, and look, what we all want is for there to be a bounce. We've been drifting down for quite a long time in terms of liberty and all the other good things, and we want it to turn up again. Now, how far we have to go down before we turn up, I don't know. I'd rather look back in a few years' time and say, yes. Whereas I thought that was the, you know, we were just gathering speed in our downward progress, I had failed to see that we were already recovering. I have no idea. You're asking questions about the future. I can see what I want to happen. I don't know what will happen. Probably things will just drift on much as they have until we all drop dead. I don't know.
Hello everyone, my name is Francis Bois and I'm from Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. I was born in Côte d'Ivoire and I lived in France, and now I live in Oxford for 20 years. And all my life I was thinking, what is my community? Well, it's humanity. And I was thinking, what I need in my community. And I've been to different communities because I'm open-minded and I like to know people. And I noticed that nowadays, as you said, some communities are successful, some communities are failing. And I want to say to everyone here and all around the world, and that's what I'm doing, any communities can succeed if there's no peace. Peace is the only way for any communities. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish or Muslim or black or white. If we don't have peace in our communities, we are going nowhere. Thank you.
I'll go now. I was just wondering, sorry to take it back to sordid politics, but the whole current situation with Brexit and so on, do you think it's possible that if the Brexit vote is in effect totally betrayed, you might have 17.5 million people who might actually feel quite strongly about things like liberty and democracy, as far as it goes, and that if an organisation or organisations come forward to take advantage of that, that might possibly be a starting point for some kind of improvement for liberty?
Communities can often be built on a feeling of betrayal. And here I'm speaking, well, let's be cynical about this. It would be delightful if we could leave the European Union on the 29th of March with whatever we individually define as an acceptable deal. We can then have a general election later this year, and we can hope that the party of our choice wins and then does the things that we desire. But none of those things strikes me as particularly likely at the moment. And so let's imagine that in the next few days Theresa May offers the same old deal to Parliament with a few promises. Oh, I was speaking to the Prime Minister of Ireland the other day, and he told me, he said, Theresa, I really don't want this backstop to last, and so I think you should accept it, you should vote for it. It's quite possible that she'll stand up in the House of Commons and say something as fatuous as that, and that she'll lose the vote. And then she'll say, okay, so do you want to leave without a deal? And everyone will shout, oh, no, we must have a deal. In that case, do you want to extend our departure? Oh, yes, let's extend it. 6 months, 24 months, 48 months, 72. We need to get this right before we do it, so we can do it properly. And, well, there'll be some people who will explode with outrage, saying that this is the greatest betrayal in British history. It probably isn't. There have been far worse betrayals than that. It's just that it's just that they didn't happen when we were alive. There'll be a few ragged demonstrations. There'll be people wearing Union flag top hats with Union flag capes in Parliament Square shouting for democracy. And most people walk past them on their way to work, not paying much attention. And there'll be people shaking their fists at the television screen. But let's face it, when it comes round to election time, the Conservatives will play the same old trick. They'll say, I know, yes, we know that we stitched you up over Europe, and we really didn't want to do that. But you know, that's water under the bridge. This election is about the future, and you really wouldn't want Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister, would you? So, you know, vote Conservative, and probably enough people will do that, and it will look as though everything is back on the road. We're back inside the European Union with some vague commitment to leave in the next 25 years, and the Conservatives have won a majority of 40, and very few of the Eurosceptics got deselected and unelected. And the Brexit Party, well, it huffed and it puffed, and everyone spoke about it very learnedly before the election, but they all lost their deposits, and Nigel Farage is no closer than he ever was to being in the House of Commons. It's all back to business as usual. It's just that somewhere in the background there is something stirring where people understand that we have been seriously stuffed, and that the institutions that we thought were our institutions, or at the very least accountable to us, are not our institutions, and they're certainly not accountable to us, and that if we want to change things, then we shall indeed need to change things. Now, that might be the beginning of improvement, but it is so easy to be optimistic. It's so easy to look forward to a great success from which other successes will lead, or it's just as easy to look forward to some short-term disaster from which longer-term successes will lead. Whereas I'm just not too sure about the successes nowadays.
Sorry, it's a supplementary question.
Yes.
So in other words, your answer is no, you don't think it's really going to be the seed for growth of liberty. But this might sound a bit silly, but this is interesting, your idea about having to form a community. I haven't really thought about this, a community of libertarians. Because we have found, even here in Oxford, the Libertarian Society, that getting anything organised is very difficult with libertarians because they're all individuals and they all end up arguing with one another and forming factions and things. But do you think there's some practical way, a bit like the Labour movement, of from right down at the grassroots, could there actually be things like an association of libertarian builders and a group for, you know, grocers for freedom and things like that? Do you think, or even something like the equivalent of working men's clubs, you know, a Magna Carta club or something like that? Do you think there's some way that in that, right from the grassroots, starting right at the beginning, and forming associations of that kind, that might actually help?
Yes, of course it would. You took me for dinner to Wetherspoons. I don't know whether you have a particular affection for the menus of Wetherspoons, but you certainly mentioned that the owner of Wetherspoons is a strong Eurosceptic, and so you feel obliged to support him. And that's what, you know, that is what we need. At the moment, some television celebrity or some entrepreneur stands up and says something which is unfashionable in terms of what the great and the good believe, and that person has the spotlight of opprobrium directed on him, and he seems to have no friends. Well, we shouldn't allow that to happen. We should make sure that we are there standing behind and beside that person, making it quite clear that we will continue doing business with that person and we will continue associating with that person. Ask yourselves, keep an eye on Anjem Choudhury over the next 18 months. Give up on ritual denunciation of what an evil man he is and how he should be stripped of his citizenship and sent back to wherever he was born. Have a look at how he earns his bread over the next 18 months and try to learn from that. It may be very instructive. Instead of simply denouncing other movements, other communities, try to find out what they're doing and see what we could usefully do.
Thank you. To come back to my belief in tribes, as well as circles of association, prudent, very impressed. This is a true story with one small alteration of fact to make it slightly more. I was in Wantage, former capital of Wessex, England, and has a statue of Albert, as I'm sure you all know, which the local yobs had vandalised the axe of at one point. And there were a row of shops, and I popped into one which was a diversified, I'm very glad it was diversified, butcher shop. They didn't just sell sausages, they sold sausages of every hue, and not just sausages, they sold every other form of provision and grocery that you could possibly want. Victuals galore. And it was surrounded on either side by various other shops. There was a pub in the row, and I thought to myself, I spoke to the butcher, and he was afraid that he'd have to go out of business despite his diversification, because he was being undercut by the pizza and kebab store next door, which were very much part of the local economy and which people were gladly going to. Unfortunately, they were specialists. They didn't diversify. They had their own views on religious slaughter of meat. So if he wanted to go to buy, in an emergency, if he'd run out of bacon baps, and he fancied going round the corner to the, let's call it kosher, just to sort of ring a change. I'm sure you all know where I'm coming from. Anyway, if he wanted to go next door to up his stocks, or to the florist, he could get his flowers from the florist, but he couldn't get his bacon baps. It had to be something else. I went to another store here in Botley, which is being redeveloped, Westway, and they were advertising bacon and eggs, and tomatoes, full English, shorthand. And I said, oh, that's interesting, halal, full English. I said, do you sell bacon? And they said, yes, of course we sell bacon. I said, and what's the cost and everything? And he says, it's turkey bacon. I said, it's not bacon. So you've got a real difference commercially and economically. What you were saying is absolutely true. There are differences which are reinforced by the club that we belong to in one sense or another. And it's increasingly sort of clubs that have been made special allowance for in the 19th century by our previous legislators.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Gabb, for coming. I think this has been a fascinating event. It's very good to see so many of you here on a rainy Thursday evening. For those of you who have had the bad luck of studying at the University of Oxford, have a wonderful vacation, and thank you very much. I hope to see you at our events next term.
Thank you. Is it the end of term?